Yeah, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and then why you think that miracles are good evidence for God's existence.
If at any point in this presentation you can't hear me anymore, just say something and then I'll just leave and come back. I guess that seems like the way to fix this.
Sounds
So,
good.
okay. Yeah, so I'm just a researcher who's always been interested in theology and philosophy of this kind. I've self-published two books. One was on the resurrection of Jesus, and I had a short chapter on miracles in there. And the second one was on Christianity and theodicy. And that first book kind of springboarded my interest into the book I'm working on right now, which is much, much bigger and a bit more academic and technical, which I'm hoping to actually have professionally published probably within the coming year on the subject of miracles and just looking into them and whether they are. So as far as the second one, do you want me just to go ahead and get into the presentation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, did you, if you don't mind, did you like grow up a Christian? Are you? I'm assuming you're a
Oh,
Christian
yeah.
now.
Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't know how much detail you wanted. Yeah, I did grow up a more of a Baptist kind of non-denominational Christian, and then probably around senior year of high school, freshman year of college is when I kind of became sort of an agnostic. I didn't really know what I believed, and I was kind of searching. And then I eventually, I liked the appeal of Christianity, so I did come back to it. Although I not necessarily, I don't hold to all the theological beliefs that I used to. So I have evolved on some things. And so that's different. So I try to be as open-minded as I can. And I will say, even doing research for this topic, I had to accept a lot of accounts from um, denominations and religions that I personally don't necessarily consider in agreement with my own theology. And so I kind of have to be open-minded and accept that and not just dismiss things because they don't agree with me. And I think that's the key to research is being open-minded and open-hearted, even if it is a conclusion that you may not feel comfortable with. So I kind of think that's a good segue to get into the general conversation. For those of you who are listening, because I can't screen share this, we did share the presentation. It's in the whiteboard section under the speaker's corner, so you'll probably enjoy it more if you're following along. I have an objection section in there, but just for time's sake, Matt said probably just don't mention it. If you have objections, we can discuss them during the Q&A. So I'll skip over that part of the presentation. So yeah, if you go ahead and for those of you who want to, you can go ahead and open up the presentation. So yeah, we're talking about the argument for miracles and whether or not that raises the probability of theism and God. So first of all, what is a miracle? Well, a miracle is usually defined as an intervention of the laws of nature by a supernatural agent. So theoretically, this doesn't have to be God. It could be an angel or a demon or some kind of spirit, whatever. But typically, in most religious contexts, it is referred to as God. Although there are, of course, people who think that other entities such as demons can interact with the world. And so the syllogism that I had laid out was premise one: a miracle is an event which could only occur through the intervention of God or a supernatural agent and is impossible in the absence of such interposing. Premise two: at least one miracle has occurred in history. Premise three: therefore, at least one event in history required the intervention of God to occur. Premise four: therefore, God exists, or God probably exists. I think premise one is pretty much definitional and tautological, and so as long as we're on the same case of definitions, I don't think they'd have much pushback. I think by far premise two is the one that would have the most pushback because that's kind of where the burden of proof lies, and premise three and four just follow from that, as far as I can tell. So I think the idea of there being, at least one miracle, these reports are pretty common. There was one 10-country survey done in 2006 among Pentecostal Christians, and just among Pentecostal Christians, over 200 million of them claimed to be eyewitnesses to what they believed to be was a miracle. And that's not counting charismatic Catholics. It's not counting non-Pentecostal Protestants and practitioners of other religions who believe that they have seen a miracle. I personally am not a Pentecostal, and I also personally have never seen something that I would consider a miracle. But I know people who tell me they have. So I will lay that out there too. And I know cases where I prayed and something did not happen. So I'll just lay that out as far as my own personal experience. There's also a 2004 survey that found that 55% of American doctors, not doctors in third world countries, no offense to any third world countries, but 55% of American doctors believe that they have personally witnessed a miracle, which was defined in the survey as a healing that they thought was naturally inexplicable. And another 75% of doctors believe that miracles do still happen today in that context. So the point of this is saying no one is saying that all of these are legitimate and all of these are proof, but it is something that is quantitatively significant that shouldn't just be hand waved away because we do have many, 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 many different accounts. And I think they should be examined. But the next question is, how do we know, when to investigate these? What are we looking for? When do we throw it out, and when do we look for further inquiry? So Using other standards from people, I have come up with a pretty good list, I think, of ways to assess miracles, legitimate ones from perhaps less legitimate ones. So first, when we're talking about miracle healings, I have several criteria that I lay out in this presentation. So the ailment is severe enough and it's not likely to remit naturally. The healing is instantaneous and it's not just gradual. The healing is complete and it's not merely just partial. They just got a little bit better. The healing is permanent and it's not just temporary. The healing is organic and it's not just psychosomatic. The healing cannot be attributed to treatment or medicine. And the healing occurs directly within a religious context. So, someone being prayed for, visiting a religious shrine, etc., and occurs instantly and immediately within that context. And comparable recoveries of the disease are not observed in secular contexts. So, in a miracle case, these should only be happening to the certain degree within religious context. We don't see similar recoveries outside religious context to the same strength. So you may have a bone heal naturally, but a bones take several weeks to months to heal. Whereas if someone were to break a bone and be prayed for and have the bone heal within 5 minutes, and we don't have any accounts of bones healing within 5 minutes outside of these contexts, that would be kind of something we'd be looking for. It'd be very unusual. When it comes to testimony as well, what are we looking for? Well, we would want a miracle to be recorded soon after the event. We don't want it to be really long afterwards or really far removed from the witnesses. So I would rather an eyewitness than someone who heard it from their uncle, who heard it from their boss, who heard it from their cousin, who heard it from their dog owner, right? You want the document to be close to when it occurred geographically, so something that didn't happen in a faraway land that we can't go investigate. The event is public and it's seen by a great number of witnesses. This isn't something that one guy saw in a back room that wasn't seen. To something that was very public and many witnesses. This was investigated by a professional or a third party. So if it's a healing by a doctor and if it's a third party, the point is we don't want this to only be reported by people who are already really prone to believe these things and are already predisposed to want to believe them. Where their judgment be clouded. If you have an Indian guru who can perform miracles and the only people who attest to these are people who are already disciples of the guru, and we don't have anyone skeptical saying, oh yeah, that's so legitimate, that would kind of be a red flag. The event should be theologically significant, so should occur within a religious context. If it's just a random thing like a unicorn being suddenly appearing in Times Square, that would be really weird, but we wouldn't really have any reason to think God was behind it. So per our definition, it wouldn't be nearly as relevant. It is not vague in the details, but specific. So who, what, when, where. If someone just said, I know someone who had paralysis and they got better. Okay, well, how long were they paralyzed for? How fast did it take them to get better? What was the diagnosis? We need to know all of these things. Vague details are not helpful because typically the devil is in the details. And this doesn't occur in cases where false memory is prevalent. So we don't want someone with bad lighting from a really far distance where it'd be hard to recognize certain things. In an event that has a lot of stress, where there's a weapon or something that's really quick, where memory can be corrupted. So now I'm going to go over a few examples really fast on some of the published literature on this. This is kind of going the criteria we're looking. So now, okay, is there anything that fits this criteria to support premise 2? Do we have any good reason to think that things like this could happen now that we've set our filters? So I've cited a couple pieces of literature here. The first one is a book by Dr. Candy Gunther Brown from Indiana University. I believe she's a religious studies teacher. And the book is called Testing Prayer, Science and Healing, published by Harvard University Press. And she goes over many examples and she, attempts to document whether or not prayer works. And she doesn't come to any particular conclusions, but she does say that science should be able to test these effects. So one example that I have posted here in this presentation is of a person named Daisy, which was a pseudonym for the anonymity, but Brown publishes this. And Daisy was legally considered audiographically impaired. She was deaf. In 1999, her hearing was considered severely impaired. In 2004, it was shown to be worse, to where she required a hearing aid. 4 years later, after the 2004 test, in 2008, she attended a Pentecostal service where someone prayed over and asked God to heal her ear. Suddenly, she said she could hear, and she took her hearing aid out. 2 weeks after that, she went and got tested by her doctor, and her healing had improved dramatically to now it was normal. So in 2004, the DBHL, which is how we measure decibels, was 55 to 90, which is considered moderately impaired to severely impaired. Whereas in 2008, 2 weeks after she was prayed for, it was 10 to 20, which is considered normal. 25 or under is typically a normal range for hearing. And she was tested again a few years after that, and it was still normal. So this wasn't a temporary placebo, but something that lasted and was permanent. The second example I have is a book by Dr. Jacqueline Duffin called Medical Miracles, Doctors, Saints, and Healing. The interesting thing about Duffin is that she's a hematologist, and she studies Catholic miracles in particular, because the Vatican has a process to which whenever they try to canonize someone to be a saint, the saint has to have at least 2 medically documented miracles, and they require doctors to overview these and review the literature to make sure it's not naturally explicable. And Dr. Duffin was recruited to look into a particular case involving leukemia remitting, because she was a well-respected hematologist. Now, Dr. Duffin was and still is an atheist, and she doesn't believe these are supernatural, but she did testify that she thought it was inexplicable and that she was very impressed by it. So that's what sparked her interest to look into some of these. And she came away saying, although I don't believe in God, I do think that inexplicable healings do happen, and I think they're very fascinating. Typically, when the Vatican does these, they don't require doctors to have any religious affiliation. They just want them to be qualified. The third one I have on here is a book by, it's an older book and published in the 1970s by Dr. Richard Kasdorf, MD. He was a general practitioner at the Mayo Clinic, and the book is called Miracles the Doctors Say Yes. And one of the, he goes over, I think, 10 or 12 different cases, but the most notable one was the case of a 12-year-old girl named Lisa Larios. If you're following the slides, I have here a picture of her and her x-rays. Lisa Larios had metastasis of the sarcoma of her hip. It was being eaten away to the point where they said it looked like Swiss cheese, and this was reviewed by 18 different doctors as far as the diagnosis goes. She only had a few months to live, and so she was wheelchair bound because her hip had been eaten away and her legs no longer supported her. So if she tried to walk, she would probably dislocate her leg or severely injure herself even more. Well, someone recommended that she go to a healing service that was visiting her town, and her mom didn't believe in that stuff, but she said, well, I guess it can't hurt. And so they wheeled the girl there. And during the healing service, she wasn't even prayed for. Someone else was being prayed for. But while someone was being prayed for, Lisa felt a heat in her legs and jumped up out of the wheelchair and started walking. Her mother freaks out because she's like, oh, my gosh, Lisa, you're going to damage your hip. Don't do that. But Lisa felt no more pain. And that day she came home pushing her wheelchair, and she rode her bike home. And that wasn't just a temporary fluke either. From that day on, she was able to walk perfectly normally with no damage to her hip. And when we look at the x-rays, which I show here and Kasdorf produces in the book, we can see that not only did the sarcoma remit, but that the bone itself was completely restored. So the reason she was able to walk on her hip in the first place when she shouldn't be able to was because the bone came back, which is not typically normal, especially instantaneously in that sense when she was wheelchair bound just a few minutes before. I also have on this slide a few journal publications. I'm not going to go over all of these, but there's a case in which a legally blind woman of 12 years was instantly healed after prayer, published in the Journal Explorer. A case of a 16-year-old boy with gastroparesis, who's pictured on the slide, was prayed for and was instantly healed. And this is in the Journal of Complementary Theories of Medicine. There's a case in which a 60-year-old man who had cerebral palsy and a crooked, curled hand and twisted limbs instantly regained muscle and was able to open his hand for the first time in 60 years after he had a near-death experience with Jesus in heaven. And a case and a study done by Candy Gunther Brown, who we discussed earlier, who did the book Testing Prayer, where she and some comrades colleagues went to Mozambique and studied the pre and post effects of people being prayed for at a healing service. So they tested people's hearing and sight. The people were prayed for, then they tested them again and found sometimes tenfold improvement. And then they contrasted these with effects of placebos and hypnosis and found that prayer did significantly better. And I just have a slide on here of more extreme versions of miracles that have been medically documented over the years. So there's a case in which a removed intestine grew back. There's a case in which a right lung and 3 ribs that were right lung and 3 ribs that were surgically removed instantly were restored. And I have the X-ray posted there. That was published in a Pentecostal magazine and reviewed by a doctor. A case in which an amputated leg was restored in the 17th century, which was interviewed by the doctors who cut off the leg and testified that they had indeed done so. Cases of doctors seeing wounds instantly close and ulcers vanish after hours at a religious pilgrimage. The instantaneous restoration of atrophied muscle, healing of blindness, paralysis, and curled limbs, and the healing of the collapsed lung within a few seconds, and that she was seen by a doctor the very next day, and the partially embalmed corpse coming back to life after 40 hours after the death was prayed over, and the death certificate is there as long as the testimony of the morticians and the doctors who reviewed it. So those are just the preliminary examples. The last thing I will go over before I close it would just be real fast the idea of, okay, so we can concede that weird things happen, but why should we think this is an argument for theism? And I would just like to say that I think we can compare the two hypotheses. One is the supernatural agent hypothesis, and the other one is the unknown natural phenomenon hypothesis. So this is the second to last slide for those of you who are following. I skipped over the objection. Oh, sorry, no, this isn't. This is the slide before the objection slide. We're not going to do the objection slide yet. So the supernatural agent hypothesis predicts that these would be naturally unreplicable and indeterminate. So because God is a free agent, we don't know when this is going to happen. So whereas the natural hypothesis says that we should be able to reproduce these under certain conditions, we should be able to see that, given certain medicine or certain conditions, we see that this remits at a certain rate and this one doesn't. The second one is, are the supernatural or are the healings superior in quality when they're in religious context? Whereas the natural hypothesis would say that the religious context shouldn't matter. You should see these happen equally in religious and non-religious contexts, and the religious one shouldn't be any more significant as terms of speed or quality than the non-religious ones. And the supernatural hypothesis explains a better variety of the healings. So if we only had healings of people with paralysis or blindness, we could say, well, this is probably a natural phenomenon because why isn't God healing these other things? But the fact that we have a very wide variety, whether it's cancer, blindness, paralysis, limbs growing back, dead people coming back to life, deafness, etc. It is simpler to say, there's an omnipotent God who can do this, whereas the unknown natural hypothesis has to posit not just one natural phenomenon, but many, many, many different independent natural phenomenons, whether they be unknown laws or unknown biological features. And of course, that doesn't even account for the non-healing ones. So in general, that's why I argue that in some cases, the supernatural hypothesis is a better explanation. So to conclude, there are many well-documented events that have occurred in religious contexts that allude to that elude natural explanation. Theistic explanations have better explanatory power in some of these cases than naturalistic explanations. Therefore, some of these cases are probably the result of theistic intervention. Therefore, God probably exists. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I thank everyone for listening.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So if you have questions, objections, I see that there's a few people in the queue. The way to go into the queue and raise a question or to interact with Caleb is at the bottom of the page, there's a hand and there's a little piece of paper with some lines on it. You click that and that'll put you in the queue. And then when I send you the invite, you'll have to click another button at the top of the screen in order to accept that invite, and that'll bring you on stage and your mic will be unmuted. So first we'll go to RJ Corvo. I've sent the invite to you, RJ. You'll see a button at the top of your screen. If you just click that, that should bring you up on stage. All right, maybe he's walked away. All right, RJ. Well, if you want to just put your hand back in the queue, I'll expedite you to the front. I'm not sure if maybe you're having technical difficulties like Caleb did, but if you raise your hand again, we'll get you back in the queue. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Jonathan. Jonathan, I sent you the invite. Hey, Jonathan, how you doing?
Hi, Caleb. Nice presentation. Doing all right. Okay, so Caleb, one thing that you mentioned that I appreciated was wanting to compare miracle claims from religious contexts to what we know about rates of healing in non-religious contexts. And a worry that comes to mind for me is this sort of the way that our sample of reports in a religious context is constructed. So one is that the people who are likely to report maybe anomalous events as miraculous spend a lot of time in religious contexts. So given that something was going to happen to them, maybe out of the ordinary, it's not terribly surprising that it would happen. And the other element of this is going to be that for someone who is not inclined to interpret something anomalous as religiously significant or miraculous, if that type of event happens to them, I might think that they'd be less likely to report it if it happened in a non-religious context. So that makes me think that the sample that we're using for the non-religious context is mostly going to be comprised of run-of-the-mill cases, maybe from hospitals, medical trials, that sort of thing. Whereas just by construction, the sample of miraculous claims coming from religious contexts and healing claims coming from religious context is going to be skewed. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, Caleb, I think we've lost audio. He's gone and coming back.
Better.
Yep.
I don't know why. I don't know what. I think it's your room is messed up, Matt. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Uh, anyway, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I know we've had these conversations before, and I always appreciate your input. So I think when it comes to reporting bias, that is a fair assessment, but I would say that I don't know if the data actually supports that. There are studies, and I know this anecdotally, but there are studies that also show that, especially among Pentecostals and people who are more prone to accept these, they are actually more hesitant to get medical verification. Most of them just say, yeah, I have faith. I don't need to see a doctor. And this is also true with certain scientists. There's actually, I cannot remember what it's called off the top of my head. There's a whole organization online of scientists who anonymously discuss things like quote unquote supernatural paranormal things that they're too uh, reluctant to say in public because they're worried it's going to hurt their reputation. And so I think what we know from psychology in these cases, people are actually less likely to report these when these happen and they think it's supernatural. They are in most cases they are more reluctant to because they're scared of how it's going to make them look fanatical. And I even know of cases of people reporting these and it not being reported as religious. So there was one case, for example, the Vatican looked at of I think it was something with like lung cancer or something that went away, and it was published in the Hawaiian Medical Journal. But the Hawaiian Medical Journal never mentioned the Vatican investigation, never mentioned the prayer, never mentioned the religious context. And so I think when these things are even reported in journals, they typically fare away from that. So I guess I just don't. I think that's. I don't think we have good evidence to think that would be the case. That we would have necessarily more reportage of this. And the second one is that even if that were the case, it's not just the fact that these are being reported; it's also the biological mechanism. So the fact that let's say someone gets healed, has a broken bone and is healed in a day versus healed in several weeks, we could say, well, the cases that are healed in a day are going to be reported in the miracle, whereas maybe these happen naturally, we just don't know about it. But the issue is it's not just reported, just it's the way that it happens. So in order to have a bone heal, you have to have cells come in, you have to have repair done to this, you have to have tissues creating cells at a certain rate, or you have to have white blood cells fighting on. It depends on what the disease is. But we know we can measure the rate. We know how fast the body produces these things. In order for something to happen that quickly and that abnormally, you would have to have a ridiculously high increase of cell count and reproduction, and that would lead to further health concerns. You could get cancer because you would have cells producing too quickly. You could have various blood conditions and so forth. So the idea that it's not only is that this happens faster, but that if this was some weird natural catalyst, we would predict that if this was uncontrolled, that this would have more negative repercussions. Whereas under theism, God knows the exact amount and can produce ex nihilo these cells. Whereas if this is a biological mechanism, it seems very convenient that it happens to fix it, very, very quickly, and also be able to stop itself from not having these conditions that we know can happen. So for those reasons, I think the theistic hypothesis in these cases works better.
So, if I may, I think that I'm not sure that connects exactly with Jonathan's objection. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but his point was like there was a point in your slide where you said that if God is the best explanation of these miracles, then you would expect them to be, if God is not the best explanation, then you'd expect them to be distributed evenly, or roughly evenly between religious and non-religious people groups. That's not an objection that there aren't such cases. And so a lot of what I heard in your response was, well, there's not these naturalistic explanations of, with cells and all that. But I think Jonathan's pushing the point of we might have like a selection bias. So he's not so much saying that there aren't odd events, so much as he's saying that, if these odd events may be occurring just as much in religious as irreligious contexts, if we do in fact have a selection bias, where we're finding these religious contexts more. Is that kind of your point, Jonathan? Am I understanding you correctly?
That's exactly right. No, I'm definitely not equipped to push back at all on any of the particulars of the claim. I'm just kind of coming at this from a social scientific standpoint where we're used to biased samples all the time, and this seems to be the exact sort of situation that would generate a highly skewed sample. And I'm worried about that without being too familiar about the details of the particular cases. So yeah, you summarized that really well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first part of the. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
To give an illustration, so I'm a Christian now. I used to be an atheist. If I had some miraculous healing, I'm going to go tell my Bible study. I'm going to go tell my pastor. I'm going to go tell everybody at my church. I'm going to tell everybody. Back when I was an atheist, if it happened, I'd probably tell a buddy. I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't tell anybody because it'd be like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? So I think that's kind of an illustration for what Jonathan's getting at.
That's exactly right. And if I can add one more thing, I think, Craig Keener and some other folks produced this documentary not too long ago. And in there, they talk about this hotline that they have where if you have something wild happen to you, you can call it in and report it as a miracle. Who do you think's going to be doing that? Not me. I mean, I could experience the most miraculous healing, quote unquote, miraculous healing tomorrow. And just because of the sort of plausibility structures that I have, I'm not going to be inclined to report that. And so, that's just one concrete example of the type of mechanism that is already in place that we all can agree is in place because we can call in the hotline right now that I think is going to generate these skewed samples.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair point as far as when people are talking about reports, but I was in that context specifically referring to medically documented ones. And typically when people write up a medical journal, they don't go, "Hey doc, I got healed. Can you write this up? This is really cool." Usually the doctor will be impressed and like, "Wow, I need to publish this." So typically people go to doctors, and the doctors are the ones making these judgment calls. And I think that from what we know from the studies with Pentecostals, they are actually more reluctant to go to their doctors. They'll claim that they're healed, but they don't usually go and try to seek proof of this typically from what we know. So I don't think that the reportage in terms of the medical literature is going to be that skewed. I think it would be fairly analogous either way. So, and that's kind of what I addressed in the first part of the question. But I think I understand your concern. But I think at best that would just make either hypothesis unfalsifiable because it would be kind of difficult to, I think, control for some of those. Saying, well, maybe these are here, but we just can't verify it because they're not reported. That's a possibility, although I don't think it's necessarily plausible, nor do I see how we could ever disprove that unless we were, monitoring every single claim that ever happened. So it's certainly a complicated question.
All right. Well, Jonathan, if you have a last word, and then I'll go to Than.
For that,
What's that?
I said nope. Thanks for that.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. You have a nice night. Thanks for watching.
All right, Than, I got an invite out to you. You'll have a button at the top of your screen to press to come on up. And RJ, I did see you before. If you're back, if you raise your hand and go back in the queue, I wasn't like refusing your question. I just there was some kind of connection issue. But Than, how you doing? Thanks for coming on. What's on your mind?
Much. Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you just fine.
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure. So Caleb, good presentation. I came in a little bit late, so the one question that I had for you, I guess, that might be helpful here is, and maybe you hit on this and I just missed it, but couldn't one say, like, if we posited some sort of like unknown natural explanation to as a possible explanation for certain healings that modern science would tell us are irreversible issues, wouldn't it seem to undercut what we currently know in general when it comes to the current sciences? So, like, for instance, I think it's macular degeneration is irreversible. There's no known cure. There's no way to treat this. And it seems like this is just completely irreversible. And so it seems like positing something natural that's unknown that can reverse this process would almost seem to undercut our scientific knowledge, at least in particular areas. And maybe you hit on this, but that's something I guess that's been on my mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would use the word undercut. I did say that a little bit with my response to Jonathan, as far as if you're going to posit, like, I think saying it's some weird unknown natural phenomenon is too vague. I think we're going to have to press for some detail. So if you're going to say, why did macular degeneration? Well, maybe the cells restored the retina or the cornea at a faster rate. Like, I think we have to be a little bit more specific, because I think we can't just treat natural phenomenon like a magic wand to say it can just explain everything. You're gonna need to get into some model with explanatory power, I think. And so if someone were to say to argue that, and we talk about mechanisms, that's kind of where I go into what I said to Jonathan as far as, okay, well, if we had to say, why did this bone heal in a day instead of in 5 weeks? Well, maybe the cells increase at a much faster rate, but then you would have to explain, well, why then did we not have too many cells where this would cause certain blood problems or cancer, or the various conditions we know that happens when you have too good of an immune system. And a lot of people don't realize that if your immune system is pumped up too much, it'll start attacking your own body. So in order to posit such drastic changes and such drastic speeds, you would have to posit some kind of boost to the immune system in this way, and then it would be almost certainly predict that it would do more harm than good, and we don't observe that. So I think that's just why it would not be a plausible explanation. But it depends on the case. So if it was something that we didn't know, but the person got better gradually, so someone was in a coma and it took them 5 weeks to get out of it, and then they got physical therapy and they eventually regained, I'd be like, well, okay, although we don't know what it is, this does seem to be a long gradual process, and it seems strange that a God would do it. It's not that God couldn't heal them gradually, but that we know natural forces work gradually, and so I don't think that the theistic explanation here is any better than the naturalistic explanation. And so in that case, I would say, yeah, this might be a better explanation, but it really would just depend on the specifics of the case. And so I don't know if that answered your question, Than.
Nope, that's good. That's all I had for you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
One other thought that your answer there kind of brought up for me was, if God were to do this regularly, right, where he just healed everybody under certain circumstances, then it might, the reason why that you're saying a naturalistic explanation doesn't work is because it is irregular, and I think one of the objections against miracles and against God is to say, well, why doesn't he heal everybody, or that sort of thing. But then if you look at things like dark energy or dark matter, where physicists predicted a naturalistic explanation precisely because it's regular, because it always happens. They predict this this dark energy. They have no idea what it is, but because it consistently pushes against gravity, they say, well, there must be this naturalistic dark energy, whatever it is. And if we posit that God has some sort of revelatory purpose with miracles, then perhaps that would also, give an answer to why we should expect them to be either rare or irregular, or why you wouldn't be able to have some sort of scientific rigor. Does that make sense, or do you think I'm off base there?
No, I think that's a good point, man. That's why I'm not a big fan of controlled studies that they've done where, okay, we have a group of people, we're going to pray for them, and then we're not going to pray for them and see who gets better. I don't think we can predict when or who God is going to heal. I think we should just be looking at cases of people who said, oh, I've been healed by God, and look at the evidence, see if that's plausible or not. And I think that I agree with you. I think that if we were able to do this every time someone was prayed for, they were healed every time, we wouldn't have any reason to think this was an agent. We could say this is some this could be almost evidence of telekinesis. Actually, we could say, well, human will, the atoms in the human mind maybe are literally able to shape reality. There are actually people, spiritual people who say this. It's called Tulpaism, to say that the mind can actually project into reality, or people who believe in telepathy or telekinesis. That could be good evidence that, well, when you pray, you're willing hard enough for this to happen, and that's why it happens. And I can explain that because we know the desires of people who are praying. We don't know the desires of God, and so it would be a better explanation to explain why it happens in every case. So I think that's a good point.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and go to the next guy. J-Buff sent me. I've got the invite out to you. Hey, J-Buff, how you doing?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you just fine.
All right, awesome.
I'll just kind of get a shameless plug here. J-Buff has an event coming up on our server May the 7th, Saturday, May the 7th, on making the case that Jesus is a failed prophet. So if you're interested in that, then please schedule for May the 7th.
I know a good person who can attend that. I know a friend of mine who would be really good for that too, he's looking into that right now as far as the Perugia stuff. So that's exciting. So I'm sure
awesome.
I'll let him know about your event, J-Buff.
Yeah, please do. Absolutely. Well, yeah, just to comment on some things that you mentioned in the presentation. So obviously just want to also give you kudos, because I think that was a great presentation. I think you broke it down very well. The one thing I wanted to comment on, more so a question, but on whether you've investigated whether this takes place outside of a Christian context. The way I see it, if Christianity is true, we would expect there to be 0 cases of genuine healing in any other religious context, and that's just because I'm basing that mostly on scripture of Jesus talking about Satan cannot drive out Satan and things like that. Of course, I also want to caveat that most other religions don't include this inherent belief in miraculous healing. I know that some sects within Islam do, but Hindus, Buddhists at large don't really have this belief that's intrinsic to the religion. So I would expect there to be a significantly disproportionate number of those claims happening amongst Christians anyway. But in my mind, I would think that we should see zero genuine healings anywhere else. I haven't researched this myself, so I haven't looked into it, but I'm curious if you have and if you found anything. Um, and and I guess one other caveat I want to just put forth too is that obviously Christianity has the privilege of having such a widespread following in first world countries where we can get we can get quality documentation from doctors and professionals and stuff like that, whereas some other religions don't have that luxury. Right. So yeah, I suppose I'm just asking, are you prepared to say that there are zero genuine healings in any other religious context? Is that something that you've researched yourself?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The last part of it partially answered what I was going to say, is that you are correct to say that because Christianity is mostly Westernized, there is I think in that case there is a reportage bias, because there, or at least the documentation is just better, because the documentation in the first world is generally better than the developing world. And Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam typically are not, they're not as predominant in countries where they have this level of documentation. So it is correct that I think a lot of these are better tested. As far as the question goes, by the way, I wanted to remind it. I understand this is an internal critique. I was only arguing for theism in this presentation, so one
Right.
could just say, I could, for all I could know, I could just say, yeah, pluralism is true. Every religion's right. Doesn't matter if they're in other religions. But if you're saying Christianity specifically, yeah, that's a fair critique. It wouldn't affect the presentation, but it would affect my particular worldview. So yeah, I opened up right before the presentation by saying there are stuff that theologically goes against, but even the Catholic healings, although I think Catholics are Christians, there are specific ones where the Virgin Mary will appear and heal people, or people pray to saints and be healed. And I don't believe saints can hear people's prayers. So that is a little bit at tension with my own theology. But
Mhm.
I would not be so bold to say that no, this never happens out of Christian context. Certainly there are reports of it. I don't know how well documented, but I'm aware of at least a few cases where I think I would put my filters on and say, yeah, you know what, I think something happened here in this Hindu case or this Buddhist case. I think that it's harder because the documentation is worse, but there are a handful I would say, yeah, something probably happened here. I don't want to just dismiss all of them.
Yeah.
So I would be willing to grant that. I would also disagree with something that you said earlier of, given scripture, I don't think we would we would predict zero of these happening. I don't think that's true even according to the Bible. You can look, for example, at Exodus, where Pharaoh's magicians are able to do lesser miracles. Jesus talks about false prophets who will perform signs. The Old Testament mentions that as well. The Antichrist will also perform signs that will lead people astray. So the idea of performing signs, actually, even in the book of Acts, you see Simon the magician who wants to know these things. So I don't see it all in scripture where it says these are only Christian. I do think that scripture says these should be superior in Christian context. Moses can both Moses and the Pharaoh's, not the Pharaohs, and the Pharaoh's magicians could make canes turn into snakes, but Moses's snake ate theirs. And they can replicate these, but it's always inferior. And I think the one
Yeah.
interesting thing about Christianity is that although certainly Christianity is not the only religion to report miracles, but Christianity does have an advantage in that the majority of its conversions, at least in the third world, and there's various studies that talk about this, are due to people witnessing what they think is a miracle. So when you have Hindus reporting healings or exorcisms, which does happen, or Buddhists or certain Islamic sects, typically, I'm not saying this never happens, but statistically speaking, this is almost always reported by people who are already Hindus or already Muslims. Whereas in the Christian case, you'll have these competitions where you'll have Christian missionaries in India, and they will pray for a Hindu, and the Hindu will be healed, and then the Hindu will then convert to Christianity. So I can understand in my theology out of God's goodness of him healing people out of mercy, if he's omnibenevolent, but it would be weird for him to perform a miracle deliberately to convert someone to a religion if that religion were to be false, or if he didn't care about religion people held to. So that's kind of a foot I would put there.
Yeah, I'd love to push back on just two quick things that you said there. I guess firstly, you mentioned that, biblically speaking, I mean, there's instances of signs and wonders being performed elsewhere, outside of, Christianity, and you're right. I think that that's 100% right. But what I was getting at is specifically on the topic of miraculous healing. That's something that you don't see in the Bible outside of a Christian or Judeo-Christian context. You don't see Satan or any other power healing someone, and presumably, I would think that's just that would align with what Jesus was saying, which is that it would be counterproductive for Satan's efforts to want to heal someone. Um, but and then the second thing I want to push back on quickly too is the thing about you were mentioning, like, when it comes to Christianity, people will actually convert from a different religion when they're healed, whereas you don't really see that a lot of times with other religions. And I guess my thought on that is that usually when these healings take place too, they're being done by some sort of evangelist, or or some sort of faith healer or something like that. Which again, you don't see that in other religions, right? Like most other religions, with the exception of Islam, aren't evangelistic in that sense. So in my mind, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of that. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's fair. So I'll wrap it up because I know that we have other people
Yeah.
waiting. So first of all, I don't know why I guess maybe pardon me for saying, but I don't really see why the healing is any more significant than any other particular one. And I do think that in Revelation, the beast is wounded. Of course, it's hard to determine how much this is metaphor, but the beast is wounded in the neck and then he heals himself, and the people are amazed by this. So I don't even know if I would agree that healings can't happen in that context. But for the second one, I will agree with you that Christians are more evangelistic, and that's why. I'm not disputing that, nor am I saying that this proves Christianity is true. All I'm saying is that if one contends that some of these are supernatural by God, although it is true Christians are more evangelistic, of course, if God wanted to convert people to Islam or to Hinduism or whatever particular religion, he could be performing these miracles and converting people. So it's not. I understand that the Christians have that cultural context, but of course, if God's the one behind it, God is at least supporting these evangelists. God could simply not. God could have the evangelists do it on their own and not perform miracles through them. Or God, if he wanted to show these evangelists were incorrect, could have people not convert, or could have greater miracles and other ones that cause people to not convert or something. So I feel like if you're going to postulate God is behind this and you're granting that some of these, I'm not saying that you are granting, but just conceptually that God is healing these people in context that converts them to Christianity, that's got to at least be some kind of pushback. And even though Christians are more evangelistic, isn't God, by performing miracles, supporting such evangelism? So that's, I guess, what I would say.
Got it.
If
Awesome.
I may,
Thanks, Caleb.
J Buff, I'm a little confused on exactly the root of the objection here, just because and Caleb alluded to this earlier. If God is omnibenevolent, then what we might expect is that if God could heal somebody or help somebody miraculously, even, and they wouldn't have, like, let's say that somebody wouldn't put their faith in Christ, and they're not going to do it anyway, then what's to stop God from healing them? If just out of love for them, even if they're never going to acknowledge him, they're not going to respond appropriately in faith, they're not going to do all these things. If God really is omnibenevolent, then why would we expect an omnibenevolent God to only offer healing to Christians? We'd certainly expect him not to do healings that would lead people astray. But in those cases when somebody is, so hard up that they're not going to turn to Jesus or turn to God no matter what you do or don't do. So in those cases, maybe he's just like, all right, well, I love you, and so I'm going to do something for you. I think Jesus says at one point that the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. That God seems to love and want to care for everybody, whether or not they acknowledge him. So I'm curious as to why we would expect, if Christianity is true, that miracles only happen in a Christian context.
Well, yeah, and I wasn't saying that if Christianity is true, it would only happen in that context. I was more so saying from a naturalistic perspective, I could see that if a lot of these healings are taking place in sort of an evangelistic context, and there's people out faith healing and stuff like that, that's something that you see uniquely in Christianity. And so I was more so just responding to the point that that Caleb was making about how you don't see these cases in in Hinduism or in Buddhism or any of these other religions where they convert from the faith that they're in to like someone converts to Hinduism or someone converts to Buddhism. Like, you don't see that, right? And I'm saying, I'm kind of offering an explanation for a potential explanation for that, being that in these cases you don't have a lot of people out evangelizing in Hindu and Buddhist context, or going out to heal people. And so from a naturalistic perspective, from my view, that helps to explain why you see a lot of that. A lot of people actually converting to Christianity based on these miracle claims, which I don't think are actually genuine. But that would explain at least why you would see that happening significantly more in Christianity than you would see in any other religious context.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and turn to the Book Lord. If you do have a question, comment, concern, you can hit, and everybody in the audience, you can hit the hand icon with the piece of paper on it at the bottom of your screen. That'll put you in the queue to come up and speak with Caleb. All right, Book Lord, I got a invite out to you.
Alrighty. So first off, thank you, Caleb, for sharing. That was actually really interesting. I had no idea that there were so many different miracle claims, at the very least, and some of the examples you provided were very vivid. I certainly don't think we would expect them on an atheistic worldview. I was going to ask one question first, but I think this one might be more beneficial for just the audience in general. I guess my question is, why would it be bad if we admitted that miracle claims did occur in other religious communities? It seems to me that we wouldn't want God performing miracles for like Hindus or Muslims because, here's the Muslim going to pray for his paralyzed friend, and God decides to perform a miracle and heal him. And as a result, those two become more devout Muslims. And that would seemingly lead them astray. And when they die, are they going to hell? And so I think the doctrine of hell might be the underlying sneaky little thing kind of hanging around in the back of everyone's minds when they're saying, oh, if God did miracles for other religions, that just makes them more confident in their religion, and as a result, they're just going to go to hell when they die. But that does have a particular view on salvation, and I guess I don't think it would be bad for God to heal those people, and I don't think that people who follow general revelation, even within their own religion, will end up going to hell. I mean, I've already been wrestling with the doctrine of hell myself, just like, how does it work? And so, yeah, that's a roundabout way of kind of rambling on, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think those are really great points. I will come out and confess that I am a Christian universalist, which is not the same thing as a pluralist for people who get those mixed up. So I do think I'm a Christian exclusivist, but I do think that eventually everyone will become a Christian, whether in this life or the next. And hell is kind of a remedial purgatorial state. But putting that aside, because that's a whole nother conversation, I do think that God meets people where they're at. And so I just don't see, God saying, well, you believe the wrong denomination, so sorry, I'm going to have to wait for a missionary to come out there and heal you. I think that, people's theology is on a scale. So you can be really close to God, you can be really far from God. And I think most people, I don't deny the religious experiences of Hindus or Muslims or whatever. I think that they really are communicating with God. I think they may be misperceiving it. Of course, they think I'm misperceiving it too. That's fine. But I think God meets people where they're at. And so, yeah, I have no issue with God doing stuff in that case. Now, that is why I pointed out that I think when confronted with what I would believe to be the correct doctrine, that God would not perform a miracle to counteract that. So I think given a Christian and a Muslim arguing and each of them perform miracles, I think God will favor the Christian and perform the greater miracle that will have the potential to convert the person. And I don't think it'll be the other way around. Generally speaking. And so I think that that's kind of the question that comes in my mind. If it's just God doing an act of mercy to help establish a belief a person already has, I don't think that that's made much of a difference. But I think when given the opportunity to convert, he does. And by the way, I've had conversations like that, or I've seen comments from like really reformed people who some of them are cessationists, but when they hear about stories of people like Muslims who have visions of Jesus that cause them to convert and go to churches, they complain of, oh, look at the churches they're going to, though. These are these like charismatic churches, or it's some denomination they don't think is legitimate. It's like, why is God sending them to bad churches? Well, I think that's just a very Western-centric way to see, oh, how dare they don't have my particular church there. It's like the charismatic ones are the ones who are doing most of the evangelism. They have the most missionaries qualitatively. The Catholics do as well. And so I think God provides people opportunities to the churches that are near them, to the missionaries that are near them, but I don't think that he's going to force any particular theology on them. So yeah, I think it just depends on your particular doctrinal convictions. But that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you. One last thing I'll say, is that okay, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess what I've gained from that is that God can heal someone not for the purpose of solidifying their preconceived beliefs, rather just for the sake of healing them. And so, just like God being all loving, and human beings being made in his image, it seems that you would expect, yeah, God would want to heal people regardless of what they believe. I mean, Jesus, see in the Gospels, he's hanging out with what you'd call the lowlifes of first century Israel. And so those people, they probably weren't even Jews. I mean, tax collectors and Roman soldiers certainly weren't Jews. So yeah, that's a good thought, and I appreciate you kind of setting that off in me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate your question.
Caleb, your comments there about denominations actually do bring up a pretty devastating argument against God's existence, and that's that if God were omnisapient, that is all wise, being all wise, he'd know how to accomplish everything he wants to. If God were omnisapient, then he would lead everybody to be a Southern Baptist. He hasn't led everybody to be a Southern Baptist, so therefore he's not omnisapient. I don't know if you have a rebuttal. Oh, he left us. That is too funny that you dropped as soon as I said that. Are you there? Oh, no audio. Sorry, Caleb. Maybe it's just that my argument was so strong that he's got to go rethink his worldview. Can I hear you now?
I can hear you.
Oh, I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Gosh, I don't know. Yeah, I know the timing of that was great. Just don't have a rebuttal.
Just, I'm done. Goodbye.
I don't. Yeah, I feel like if we talk about that, that could be a whole nother call and conversation.
Yeah.
But let me just give you my 15 second personal answer.
I did mean it as a joke, by the way.
I know you did. I personally just would say, because that is relevant. I just think that given the hiddenness, I think that there's a lot of good in telling, and so I think that instead of God just telling us what it is, it's nice that we have people to do this for us, and it provides opportunities for missionaries, and there's a lot of goods come with those. And I think that a view of Revelation where it's just absolutely concrete and there's no disputation behind it is really boring. And I think it's nice that I wouldn't be doing this presentation right now if it was if we all agreed God exists and miracles happen. Okay, whoop-de-doo, who cares? We don't argue about whether trees exist because it's so obvious. So I think the fact that there is some details that aren't given to us is what makes us want to learn about it and explore, and what makes us passionate about these topics, because these are in question. So I just think that makes it more interesting and more disciplinary, in my opinion.
Sounds good. All right, let me send an invite to Hats Off. Hats Off, you should be on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jackson, for your excellent presentation. Thank you so much. So I guess my question was, gosh, I'll try to make this quick. I wasn't quick the last time. I'll try to be quicker. Julian Baggini, he's one of my favorite philosophers. I think he's an English philosopher, I want to say. He's an atheist, and he has this book, and he essentially says, and I have the exact quote in the general channel if you want to go read it. But the gist of it is, he says, look, all the strong evidence tells in favor of naturalism. Only the weak evidence tells in favor of, what you might call supernaturalism. And he has, I must admit, kind of almost a slipshod characterization of good versus weak evidence. But the basic idea I don't think is wrong, which is that, evidence is better if more people, or if it's more available to inspection in some sense. And that's probably not a perfect characterization, but I think it captures kind of the gist of what does constitute good evidence. And that might be right or wrong. But even if you think that's wrong, even if you think that that's kind of a wrong characterization, I think there is kind of an intuitive sense that the evidence that you presented, and you presented a lot of evidence, and I was listening carefully, although you went kind of fast, so I'll have to go back and review it, I guess. But there is kind of a sense in which, I mean, it's not particularly persuasive, at least on first listen. And that doesn't mean that your argument is a bad one. You presented your evidence, and that's great. But we all have to use our best judgment. And I guess my question is, with all that introduction, which I tried to make quick, hopefully it was quick. Have you talked to colleagues? What do they think? I don't know. What do you think of that? Is it really, like, I guess, gosh, is it evidence that you think should persuade someone who doesn't share your, I don't even want to say it, but, well, I'll end it there.
And there's no need to rush. Hats off.
My mic work. Oh,
I can
yes,
hear
it
you
is.
now.
Okay.
If I can, just to clarify Hatsoff's question, it sounds like what you're saying, Hatsoff, is that like how do we? It seems like we're justified in coming at this with a very low prior probability of miracles, and perhaps so low that it would overcome these sort of distant. I mean, by distant I mean, like, I don't know any of these people that run the slides. These distant reports. Is that kind of what we're getting at? Is that, like, well, look, my life doesn't seem miraculous. You got these reports on a slide, but I've got my own life, and maybe my prior probability of miracles should be so low that I don't consider your evidence persuasive. Is that kind of the direction you're going?
I think that is a big part of it, but it's not just my life. I think it's the lives of people who we trust, and again, something about, and it may not be exactly this, but something about being available for inspection.
Yeah. So, okay, my mic's working this time. I think that's a good question. So. It is, yeah. There you go. To explain that. By the way, I'm not a professor, but I'm very complimented that you would think that I am. I'm just a guy who finds this interesting, who researches this stuff. But to address the question, first of all, I do think that when I was going over criteria, and I put the presentation on the whiteboard so you can look over it. I know it was a lot, and I know I was talking fast because I naturally talk fast, and I also only had 15 minutes, and so I was trying to fit as much in as I could. But I do think that the reason I lay out these criteria, I'm not saying that we should necessarily be unskeptical of claims reported second or third hand, or they don't know the name of the person. That's why I tried doing cases where there is solid medical documentation, where I name the people. I didn't say it in the presentation, but I can give you the doctor's name. So it's not just something that happened in a faraway land that no one ever investigated, that we can never check up on. And so I applaud that. And there are a lot of Pentecostals who've gotten back at me at that, saying, no, we have to take these on faith. We shouldn't try to put God in a test tube. But no, I don't see why we shouldn't attempt to test these and falsify these if possible. In fact, that's why even though I'm not Catholic, I will compliment the Catholic Church in that they are very scrupulous about these things. In fact, I don't know if you've ever heard of Lourdes, France before. It's a famous pilgrimage site where they believe the Virgin Mary appeared back in the 1800s. But people go there to be healed every year, and there's a grotto where people go, and they actually healing claims are so common they actually have a medical bureau set up of doctors, and these doctors are not all Catholics either. They just have to be credentialed, and most of these cases are thrown out because they're not credible, they're hearsay, or it's pretty easily explicable, and so they're pretty strict as far as their criteria. And to date, there's been about 70 confirmed miracles. Now that's less than 1% out of how many thousands report it, but it's still, so it's not as if no one's investigating these, and there are some of these that are published in journals where they're obviously not just going to publish any Joe Schmo telling them that their friend's boss saw something. So it just depends on the case. But as to the second part of it is of should this be more available? I think Matt made a good point saying these things do need to be somewhat rare. I mean, if this happened every day, no one would care. It would be less impressive. And I think God needs a sense of autonomy in his creation to where he wants things to work out generally without his intervention. Now, maybe he intervenes every once in a while to get an important message across, but it's not the norm for a reason. And secondly, I would be careful when we talk about we and about people we trust, because I know that this is a very Western-centric way of viewing it, but the vast majority of people in this world do believe in God or something like a God, and even among atheists, polls show that a lot of them believe in ghosts or believe in some higher, something, and a lot of non-religious people still believe in some higher power, even if they're not religious per se. So the percentage of the world's population who is actually like naturalists, as far as there are new supernatural things that exist and interact with the world, is actually quite small proportionally, and that number is shrinking because birth population rates in religious countries are a lot higher. So I just think that the natural human condition is to believe in the supernatural, and that's I think that I would argue that posits our background information. Now we can say that's a false belief, maybe it's something that just comes to us through evolution, but regardless, I don't see why we should discount that as a reputable epistemic starting point. And I think that it's weird to start from this methodologically naturalist sense of we're going to be very think it's very unlikely that such things could interact, when most people would seem to think to the contrary. So that's part of it. And as I said, I have not personally seen anything like that, but there are people I trust, and I think the scientific method works based on trusting what scientists say. If I was to say I'm not going to believe any study unless I myself have personally replicated it, I would have to throw out most of science. Now, of course, science can be replicated, although even the social sciences usually can't. And even among the natural sciences, there was a study that showed that 40% of them aren't replicated. So replication is a whole nother issue. But regardless, even if it was replicated, I personally didn't see it replicated. I had people telling me that they saw this replicated, or organizations whom I trust. And we do have people who distrust these organizations. We do have people like young earth creationists or anti-vaxxers or even flat earthers who will say, yes, all of these people are lying. It seems obvious to me that this is true, and people I know. And so this is all being faked. And I think that most of us would say that's just irrational, that even if we can't always observe it, we should trust testimony when it's good enough, and we should trust the plurality of testimony if we have reasons to think that it's not suspect. So that's my long answer to the question. But yeah, if you had any things to go off of that.
Well, it's a very good answer. Thank you. But I'll think about it. Maybe I'll raise my hand again. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Go check out the presentation again if you want to look. And like, I just, not even now, like after the fact. And if you ever want to hit me up about anything in particular, he's down there. You can still hear me though. Yeah, as I'm saying, I am working on a book, and so I will keep you updated when that's published. And yeah, you'll be able to see all kinds of stuff like this with the footnotes and all that in there. And hopefully, I don't mean that just as a shameless plug. Like if it's something that genuinely interests you, I'm hoping to have some kind of impact, and that it'll be interesting. So yeah, thanks.
So I'm a little bit curious about your response there, just because I'll full disclosure. When I saw you wanted to present on are miracles good evidence for God, even I raised an eyebrow, and I was like, oh, well, let's see what this is going to be, And so, I just found myself naturally being somewhat skeptical, and I'm a Christian. I'm a committed Christian. Do you think that that's unreasonable to expect naturalistic explanations as a prior probability? Is it? Was I being irrational in a sort of initial skepticism, or is that not quite what you were?
No, I don't think you're being irrational. I have that too. Whenever, especially if it's something that disagrees with what I think. Especially if it's something I want to not be true. Oh, here's a case that would be problematic. So yeah, I absolutely understand people being skeptical, and it's not something that you see every day, hence the point. Although the reason I get that response a lot, by the way, and I think that's important because I think in discussions of theism, and I say this in the first chapter a little bit, outside of the resurrection, the argument for miracles really is not discussed that often outside of Hume, in terms of like philosophical circles. And I don't know if that's because a lot of it requires medical stuff that philosophers are not qualified to comment on, or just because they haven't looked into it. But I feel like there's a lot more discussion of cosmological and teleological moral arguments and ontological arguments than there is about case studies of miracles. And I feel like that's a shame. I personally find this very interesting. And I think with people I've talked to, of course, not everyone, a lot of them will say, that's really weird. And that it'll get them to think, even if they don't come to it, they will say, you know what, I used to think all this was bogus. Now I do think that there is weird stuff that happens, even if I don't think it's God. I no longer say that this is all completely uncredible. There are some credible stuff that happens that we don't know. And it is at least somewhat interesting under theism, even if they might not think it's good evidence. So it just depends on who you are. But yeah, I absolutely understand the skepticism. And one thing I would comment on that I usually ask people who say that is, do you believe, Jesus was resurrected? And do you think that that's because some people say, well, that happened 2,000 years ago with documents written much later, so on and so on. And we have living eyewitnesses to these miracles. And so if we're going to throw out these, do we have to be more skeptical of the miracle that you have to believe as a Christian? I'm not saying the evidence is always as good, but it just depends. There are cases I know where we have living witnesses, we have more witnesses than we do the resurrection. We have medical documentation. And so it's hard for me to say that these are worse attested than the resurrection. I mean, it just depends on the case.
Yeah, you had x-rays in your presentation. We don't have any x-rays in the Bible, so there is that.
It would be unless you believe the shadow turn is authentic, but that's a joke, yeah.
All right, let me go ahead and send an invite out to Brute Facts. Thank you so much for waiting patiently. Got the invite out to you. You'll click a button at the top of your screen to come up. Hey, Brute Facts, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going? How's it going?
Good. How about you? What's on your mind?
Professor Caleb. That's going to be your name from now on, Caleb.
Oh boy.
I actually had a few things. I hope you have a minute or so. The first one I wanted to say is, for anybody who doesn't think that Caleb doesn't do really good due diligence on it, I'd actually talked to him about a possible miracle that we had thought for years was. And when I explained it to him, he gave me quite a few alternative points to consider. And in the end, after just a couple of minutes of doing a little search, it turns out it wasn't as much as a miracle as we thought it was. However, we hadn't looked into the issue in many, many years. So he was really, really thorough with that. The question I have, Caleb, is, has anybody, or first of all, is there a way to quantify the probability of the events that are, labeled as being highly unlikely? Of course, that's, probabilistic language. Is there a way to possibly do that? And has anybody tried to maybe form some type of Bayesian argument from miracles?
Yeah, that's a good question. There have been people who've done it with the resurrection. So Richard Swinburne famously did it and got 97% in favor. The McGrew, and he had he started with 50% chance that there's a God. And Lydia and Tim McGrew did it, and they started with a very low prior for the sake of argument. I think it was like 10 to the negative 20 or something. And they ended up getting 99.9% in favor of the resurrection. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend their numbers because it gets, technical as to what data you're putting in and out. But the question is, have people attempted to do this? Yes. And there have been people who've done it on the other side who've gotten less than 1%. It just depends on what data you put in. The closest thing outside of that, to my knowledge, Craig Keener did do, I think it's in the appendix of his book, because he has within his immediate circle, and his wife is from the Congo, I think he said he has over a dozen accounts within his own family or his immediate circle, like friends of family, who have cases of people who've risen from the dead. And so he did a Bayesian argument as far as if all these are just people prematurely dying, what's the probability? And he got to 1 in several billion that this would be people being prematurely buried or being pronounced dead. And he was like, if this is the case, we're pronouncing a lot of people dead prematurely and burying people who shouldn't be buried. So I think that's the closest thing I can think of. Yeah. And by the way, yeah, thank you for mentioning that case. Yeah, I try to be as scrupulous as I can, and that was I believe it was a certain condition that when I looked into it, it can remit naturally within a few months, and that was about the time span that you had said that had happened within your family. And I was like, I'm not. You had medical documentation, but it's like this could be a natural remission. This isn't that unusual, so that's why I was like, yeah, this probably isn't a miracle. But yeah, I do try to be scrupulous, and I appreciate you for giving that anyway. And me doing it. So I wasn't trying to crush your bubble, because there'll be people who will be so fervent and they'll say, no, I know God healed me and stuff. It's like, I'm not here to tell you God didn't heal you. Maybe he did. I'm not saying he doesn't. I'm just saying it wouldn't fit my personal criteria that I think for rigor. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And I mean, along those lines, like Matt was talking about, I am very skeptical of really, I don't mean anything to my brothers and sisters, in the charismatic movement. I just, there's so many things that, purported. Now, I don't put anything past God, and I don't question people's personal experiences, because I've been wrong way too many times. But I even have to constantly remind myself, that if God exists, then a resurrection or miracles is not anything to God, looking at the universe that he created. But also that's kind of what I was thinking about. You had mentioned Swinburne. The first time I went through his analysis, he comes out with an outrageous number. And even Tim McGrew has critiqued him on the enormous.
Tim McGrew doesn't think he goes far enough. Tim McGrew thinks it should be higher.
No. Tim McGrew, the McGrews come out a lot lower, because
no, the McGrews are you might need to read the paper again. The McGrews have 99%. Richard Swinburne has 97%. They do have a lower prior. I don't know if that's what you mean, but even with
I'm talking about the overall Bayesian analysis. Because I've been going through the McGrews and the Blackwell Companion for Natural Theology, the resurrection argument from miracles. I didn't know the McGrews came out that high.
Well, you can email Lydia McGrew or read the paper. I'm pretty sure it's 99%.
Yeah, I know that the priors are that. I know that it's so top heavy that even prior probability is not an issue. You could start with extremely low priors, but not to derail it. The other part to it was I don't remember in the slideshow whether or your presentation at all, whether you'd actually mentioned supernatural. However, you did allude to naturalistic answers a few times. I have a really hard time with the supernatural naturalistic distinction. I think it is not very well defined, like either one of them are.
Starting to lose your audio there, Brute. There you're back.
Well, yeah, you have a lot of background noise coming through, Matt.
I don't hear anything.
Oh, well. Oh, okay. Maybe it's me. Sorry. I was hearing a lot of noise from you.
I can hear you, though, so it's okay.
All right. Well, so did you get the gist of what I said about the I have a hard time with the supernatural naturalistic distinction. I don't think it's very well defined. Is there a particular working definition that you use for the distinction in the presentation, or at least the naturalistic explanations?
I agree that I think it's hard to define, and that's why I think maybe I said supernatural agent, but I typically
I don't think you did. I just remember hearing naturalistic. That's why I was saying I wasn't sure if you actually had said supernatural, but I know a lot of
I
people.
have to go check the slides, but doesn't this just show that memory is unreliable, so we can't trust testimony, right? I'm kidding. But yeah, that's a good question. I think supernatural would be something that's immaterial and non-spatial, so it's not made up of matter, it doesn't take up space, and it's an agent. It has it's conscious. So I wouldn't count abstract objects. They are immaterial, but they're not supernatural in the same way because they're not agents. They don't have wills. They don't have desires. They're not a mind. So I would count supernatural as God, angels, demons, stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right, well, Gabe, if you got a last comment, then I'm going to go ahead and go to Kevin.
Yeah. No, I'm good. That's it. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks.
Mhm.
All right, Kevin, I got an invite out to you.
Hello.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
Good so far. First of all, cool presentation. I liked it a lot. On the slide, God is the best explanation. Personally, I would expect the first stick points to be changed because if the phenomenon is natural but unknown to us, we don't know which conditions we need to make it repeatable. On the other hand, we have prayer and religious rituals that, if they work, that is the condition. We have prayers, rituals, yada yada yada, and we have a God behind that. And so we should expect that if we have the same conditions, the prayer, the rituals, that we should see the same results in miracles. So for me, miracles in some cases is actually a case against God.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I think Matt and I briefly discussed the first part of it, but I think if we're positing that this is an agent, right, that this is a being with free will, then conditions are not necessarily relevant. I mean, they're not. I shouldn't say they're irrelevant. They're not going to determine necessarily the outcome because given libertarian free will, for example, you can have identical conditions and get different results. And no one, I don't think any theist or at least any Christian would posit God always in every case answers prayer because that's very easily falsified. We can just look in the world and say, look, all the suffering. Clearly, God doesn't answer every prayer. And if the whole point of a miracle is to stand out as exceptional and to get people's attention, then I don't see why you would predict these would be very common. And so I think that's why we have this kind of indeterminism. As far as your first point, it is true that it is hard to replicate things that we don't know the conditions. But I think that there's ways that this can be done without doing this in a lab with controlled settings where we could at least postulate a natural explanation is better. So, for example, there are certain kinds of cancers, spontaneous remission of cancer. We usually don't know why it goes in remission, but we can look and say that, for example, lung cancer, or I forget if it's lung or breast cancer. Breast cancer goes in remission fairly often. I think it's like 1 in 5 cases or so goes into some form of remission with or without chemotherapy, and that people who get infections are more probable to have remission of cancer than people who aren't. So even if we were looking and say, okay, I don't know why the person had cancer remission in this case, if it is true that we can observe that, well, these people had infections. Now, obviously, we're not putting them in the lab and giving them infections to test this, but we can say, well, although I don't know what it is, I would say that the infection at least has probably some kind of impact because it seems to be a positive correlation. And so, and same with the fact that certain cancers go away at more significant rates. It's like, well, either God just happens to like some cancers more than others, or there's some aspect about the biology of this disease that makes it more prone to the immune system or something. So it would be looking for things like that. And obviously, we don't know every condition, but if there's some kind of correlation that we can form in settings like this, I think that's when the natural explanation would be better. So I would, that's my point. I would disagree with the second point about we should expect God to always do this and always respond to the conditions at that point.
Okay. The problem I have with this free will aspect of the agent is that oh, I forgot my point. Sorry, one sec. That at best this whole argument here is a survivorship bias fallacy, and any other case in which there isn't a miracle, even we have the same conditions. Someone is praying, someone has a ritual. The theist has to hide behind a sentence like God acts in mysterious ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, that just comes to the question of theodicy, right? And that's a whole nother issue. So, regardless of what your model is, if you think God has reasons for allowing evil and suffering in most cases, then in most cases, God's not going to intervene. Sometimes he does, but these are very rare, comparably. And so that just depends on your model of theism as to why God is allowing this. If it's for free will, if it's for soul building, if it's for autonomy, whatever it may be. We have to factor that into the hypothesis. I don't think we can hypothesize God always answers prayer because, again, that's very easily disproven because we do know of cases where people pray and it doesn't happen. So
yeah, exactly. That's my point.
right, but I don't think theism predicts that God answers all prayers. So I don't see why that's relevant. I understand what you mean by survivorship bias, but again, that's why it's a case by case basis. I'm not just saying sometimes people are healed, therefore God probably exists. It's the nature of the healings themselves. So it really just depends on the circumstances.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So we're pushing up on time. Caleb, if you have any final comments, and then where can people hear more about your content, or if they want to hear more about what you have to say?
Okay, we're not doing the rest of people who have hand raised. Yeah, I know we've gone over.
Yeah, we're
Hour and a half.
closing the end of time. Sorry, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, no, it's fine. You can find me on Clubhouse or hit me up on Discord if you want to invite, and we can do another survey if you have any other questions or anything like that. I'm more than welcome to talk to people afterwards. But yeah, I have 2 books on Amazon. One of them is called Undead, a historical investigation to the most famous miracle in history, which is about the resurrection. And the other one on Amazon is Searching for a Solution to Suffering, a Christian Response to the Problem of Evil. I can link both of those in the chat if it's easier. I also have been on various shows on YouTube. I don't really have my own channel right now. Sometimes I co-host one, but just, if you type in Caleb Jackson, God or miracles or something on YouTube, you'll get quite a few results. So that's kind of the places I would point you to. I also contribute to a friend's blog called Think Christian Theism, and I do have a few posts on miracles there, including I have a pretty detailed one about the amputee case that I very briefly mentioned in the presentation, because I have a whole blog post on that, and it's going to be a whole chapter in the book. So, yeah.
Perfect. Sounds great. Well, thanks so much, Caleb. I appreciate you coming on and your presentation and answering all the questions. And thank you all for attending in the audience. If you want to see more events like this, you can go on the left panel, go up to the events tab, and you'll see what future events we have planned there. Or if you'd like to present yourself, stake a claim, and ask your questions about it, you can see the Be a Speaker tab under the server details. So thanks so much, Caleb, and I hope everybody has a great evening.
Yep. Thank you, Matt.